All right, this is Mr. Reed coming at you live from S211. This is for Ozymandias Breakdown for 10th grade, summative for your mock or practice IOC for your actual IOC later in 11th grade here. But just a little disclaimer that I am not actually doing an IOC. I've already done one of those. This is just a breakdown of Ozymandias. Looking for certain components, looking for certain things that I would expect to see within your annotations for your summative here. So again, this is not an IOC, just sort of a little breakdown. So let's begin here. Ozymandias, the title in itself is a reference to Ramses. So we kind of have a sense of historical context here. This is also an allusion. I'm just going to say Egypt. I don't remember how to spell Ramses off the top of my head. But again, so we kind of get a sense of that this is going to be a political poem. This is going to be one that makes some historical references, maybe somewhat fictional. But again, something that just to kind of tie this back to a sense of context. And we'll talk a little bit about the author as well later on. But let's get right into it. I would start with just in your notes by mentioning that this is a sonnet that is an iambic pentameter. It is 8 lines, which is a 6 sestet, and this is the rhyme scheme in this poem. Just a little bit of background information. This is a pretty experimental poem for its time period. Nowadays, not so much, but for its time period, this was pretty wacky. This has an AB rhyme scheme, which then shifts to a CDE CDE, which is it seems kind of basic, but then you will see in the 9th line that there is an odd shift, and this is for 2 reasons. This poem can be broken down into 2 components. So here we go. Here's the first 2 components right here. Right here, okay, and then the second part of this poem is broken down. So we have 2 components, and there's a real big shift in tone, and then I also think that break in the meter is intentional. That's a volta, that's a change in tone, but it's also to put the focus back on the purpose of this poem, which is to expose some of the political issues during that time period and Percy's own views on political figures. But again, I'll get back to that in a little bit here. But just to know that you can break this down into 2 poems, but there are actually 3 narrators or 3 speakers in the poem. The first one is the first line here, and it's a very basic. We don't really know much about who this is. It might be Percy. It might be just some random guy. It might be Mr. Reed. Who knows? Who knows? But the point is that it's just someone speaking. They are maybe somewhere traveling, and they meet with another fellow traveler in an antique land, so somewhere that is old, somewhere that is vast, but we don't really have a sense as to where this land is. It might be somewhere, within the Middle East, but again, it's very vague. But we do establish some sort of setting in this poem here, and we have our first speaker, who only refers to themselves as I, and then we establish our second speaker here as well. And then we have an interesting use of punctuation here. This is actually an interruption of the original poem and its flow here. So this is a stylistic device. It's somewhat abrupt, and you will see that there is some abruptness within the poem in itself. It doesn't really flow very smoothly throughout. Also, we have the ellipses here as well, which is another example of a breaking of a thought or an idea. So if you are looking for stylistic devices, or you're struggling to find that, those are 2 things right there. So 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone. So we infer that something, whatever it is, was destroyed. Okay. We also have examples of alliteration here, T and T, so two trunkless legs. So again, it's supposed to, use of alliteration here is intentional. And the reason, sure, let's go with pink today. Why not? Two trunkless legs, all right? We don't know exactly what we're talking about as of yet, but we know that this is foreshadowing what is going to actually be the subject of this poem, which is a statue, and rather it's Ozymandias' statue. So this is intentional to get the reader's attention. Okay, from there we go to stand in the desert near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. Okay, so again, let's talk about sound devices here. So we have stone, and I'm going to do this in a different color. We're going to go orange, we'll go stand, desert, right? And what we call this is something called sibilance. And sibilance we associate with the snake sound. It makes a s, all right? And we usually, a snake is symbolic for evil. Now, I don't know if Ozymandias is technically evil, but we get a feel for the tone of this poem, that either something is going to happen that is going to be slightly maybe doom-like, or maybe depressing, or maybe it's Ozymandias, maybe it's the character, maybe it's the statue that is supposed to be inherently bad. Again, we can continue on. I'm not going to highlight everything, but sunk, shattered, visage, whose. It continues on. Sneer. Again, these are all examples of sibilance. They are also examples of alliteration, because some of them start with the letter S. Some of these are more consonant sounds. But again, they all kind of create sort of to some extent, some flow to the poem, even though it is broken up by things like the ellipses. So we continue on from here. Half sunk and shattered, a visage lies, which literally means to stand in. So it's something, some statue or something standing in the middle. It gives us a sense of location. All right, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Again, we have some examples of alliteration here, cold and command. Again, the author is wants you to pay attention to these details. These are important. Cold, command. So again, what exactly does this mean? We have frown, we have wrinkled lip, we have sneer, we have cold command. This sounds like someone who's relatively harsh, someone who's not a good person, personality-wise. Meh. All right, keep going down here. Tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. Okay, so again, we got lots of examples of alliteration and sibilance here. Sculptor, survive, stamped. All right. We also have a sculptor. We have another character within this poem. So who this person is exactly, we're not entirely sure. But clearly this is someone who had produced this statue. Maybe it was ironic. Maybe it was supposed to look bad, even though Ozymandias was supposed to be a great leader. Maybe this was, maybe the sculptor intended to make Ozymandias look kind of like a jerk, right? Could have been that. Which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. This is a paradox, as we are supposed to be giving life to when we produce a statue. We are supposed to be producing some sort of life or some sort of memory, and yet this is something that is lifeless. So this is a paradox. Oop, paradox. There we are. All right. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. Okay, now we have our shift. Okay, so this line, this is line 9. This is something called a volta. This is when the poem, the tonality of this begins to shift. So tonality, volta, shift. All right. And this is where, from here, the focus of the poem becomes a little bit more coherent. We also have a change in speaker at this point. Now, this is where there's some debate, and maybe it's Ozymandias, maybe it is the sculptor who has engraved this, so thus the sculptor is speaking it because the sculptor gave life to Ozymandias. But just know, again, that there's a third speaker. There's also a tremendous amount of irony in these 4 lines here, or these 5 lines. But before we get into the irony, let's continue to look at some of the sound devices. So we have King of Kings. Okay, again, a nice example of alliteration. It's something that is being emphasized. This is the guy. This is the man. My man, right? We have colossal, wreck. We have lone, level, stand, and stretch. Again, emphasizing sort of this, the way in which the sculptor or Ozymandias is describing these things. It sounds like he has built this vast, expansive, successful kingdom, and everything around the kingdom seems to just have decayed. It's fallen apart because it just cannot stand the same amount of time and vitality as Ozymandias' kingdom. But at the same time, if you look at this ironically, obviously the statue is the only thing that continues to be around, so thus it seems like his own kingdom and everything else has fallen into despair and decay. Thus we have an example of situational irony. So I'm just going to write that down at the bottom here. Okay. So the statue wasn't always in a desert, and thus it is somewhat ironic. It was probably at the focus of this kingdom here. It's relatively ambiguous. This work may have never stand a chance to Ozymandias, and thus it would have crumbled. So there's some examples of dramatic irony there as well. The thing I'd like to note with the Volta, going back to that real quick. This is where, if you're counting the lines at this point, you've been following the CDE, CDE. Here we actually have a completely different rhyme scheme. There is sort of a break here, so this is also kind of helps us a little bit about the Volta. So some of the themes that you could talk about and that you can incorporate within these annotations themselves, obviously living forever, transcendence, the deep irony behind that, pride. You could talk a little bit about art, and then obviously there's also a conflict. There's both man versus man in this poem as a conflict, technically, because Ozymandias, again, is competing with other people, but there's also man versus nature. Which is another, one of the main subjects of the Romantic writers, right? They are writing about how nature is greater than humans and industry, and it's something that is conflicting with their views because they're looking around observing society and industry and how it's slowly taking over their own lives, but also taking over nature. So again, another theme that you could find within this. And then my final little note is about Percy Shelley. You should do a little bit of research on all of these authors before you take your summative. But with Percy Shelley, he was a writer, both a political and social activist. And this entire poem is really just commentary on the time period in which he lived and some of the political figures that were ruling the society, where he came from. And this is sort of both a kind of a prod and a tongue-in-cheek response to them, especially since many of them tried to act, either Christ-like or tried to create movements or have ideas that would stand the test of time. And yet here we are many years later, and Ozymandias and many of the other politicians were, their ideas are in decay and are long forgotten. So I hope you found this helpful. Obviously, there's a lot more, hopefully, that you were able to annotate. But if there's anything big that I am missing that should be included in this, let me know. And good luck on your summative.